Hello, welcome to week 6. This week in PCS coding, we're going to be covering coding procedures for the cardiovascular system and the respiratory system. These two can be a little bit confusing, so I wanted to emphasize some key points to keep in mind as you work your way through this. There are several different root operations that you will see when coding cardiovascular procedures. These include such things as measurement and monitoring. A lot of people get confused with what a cardiac catheterization is, and the operation you'll use will be measurement and monitoring. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the video lecture. The other thing you'll see is a dilation that's used for the percutaneous transluminal coronary angioplasty. The PTCAs performed to widen a blocked coronary artery. We also use insertion for pacemakers. We use bypass, which we'll talk a little bit about in more depth in just a little bit, and replacement, or say aortic valve repairs and replacements, right? So again, you need to take a look at what the operation is. If you don't quite understand what a cardiac catheterization is or what an angiogram is, there are a lot of sources you can look those up on YouTube, WebMD, and others. Another thing is the approach, and these are a little bit more straightforward, but they're usually either percutaneous endoscopic, or they're open. Always read the procedure note, the op report, if you will, to find out exactly what they were doing in terms of the approach. One final note about bypasses, and very important, and this can be very confusing to people. You always want to read the notes so you know what you're bypassing from and what you're bypassing to, right? So from and to, that will determine what character you use and give you the correct code. So, for example, with aortocoronary bypass, the blood is being routed from the aorta to a coronary artery, right? If they're using a saphenous vein, it's coded as a device, autologous vein tissue, right? If you're doing the same type of procedure, but you're using an internal mammary artery, right? It's not coded as a device because it's not detached. You're just rerouting it, right? And the number of coronary arteries bypassed determines the body part value, not the number of grafts used. And this is in your text. We'll cover it in the video lecture as well. So what to look for the device selection, look for multiple codes. For example, if you're doing a vein harvesting and you're taking the saphenous vein and then you're using it to bypass, how many procedures are you going to be using there? Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about Chapter 13. Chapter 13 is the respiratory system, and the most common PCS root operations will be excisions, drainages, say, like chest tubes, what have you, dilation, insertion, such as trachs, endotracheal tubes, bypasses, resections, and others. Now we do these video assisted thoracoscopic surgeries, so that opens up a whole new way of approaching these things, right? So your approaches, the most common ones are via natural or artificial opening, like a bronchoscopy. It's going through the bronchus, right? The percutaneous and the open. And again, for procedures like bronchoscopic biopsies, be sure to recognize that there's not a device. We talk about a device only when it remains in, right? And the qualifier diagnostic indicates that it's a biopsy. And again, mechanical ventilation is not coded in the medical section, surgical section, excuse me. It's coded in the extracorporeal assistance and performance, and it's time-based. Anyway, a couple of takeaways that are common to both chapters include paying close attention to the root operation definitions. If you're unclear, double check the alphabetic index and follow some of the hints for this in the end of chapters 12 and 13. Read the language carefully in the operative note. That will guide you as to what the approach is and the correct root operation and if there's advice remaining. Anyway, that's all I have for you. Have a great week and we'll see you online. Bye now.